Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're looking at one of the most intense, emotionally turbulent periods in all of American history, the early months of 1865. We are going to clearly outline the path from the monumental passage of the 13th Amendment right up to the war's breathtaking conclusion. So we're dropping you right into the dramatic final act of a conflict that literally tore a nation apart. And we'll examine this incredible emotional whiplash of triumph that was so quickly shadowed by unprecedented tragedy.
Okay, let's dive right into this. Picture it, January 1865. There's this massive question looming over everyone. With military victory clearly in sight, what would the cost of true peace actually be? Because militarily, the Union is definitely winning. The Confederate economy is totally crumbling, their armies are starved of resources and men, but true peace, well, that's a whole different story. Millions of lives and the permanent fate of enslaved people still hung in the balance. The North was just exhausted. Dragging the conflict out any further meant more devastation, for sure.
Part 1. The 13th Amendment.
So, to understand how the war truly concluded, we have to start with January 1865. President Abraham Lincoln is intensely involved in making sure the 13th Amendment makes it through Congress. And in this incredibly narrow historic vote, it passes. It constitutionally banished slavery nationwide. I mean, just imagine the electric energy in that room. Black men and women watching this historic vote from the galleries, finally seeing this monumental shift happen right in front of them. But they also knew that the real work for equality was literally just beginning. Fast forward a couple of months, and Lincoln gives his second inaugural address. This brilliantly illustrates the stark, honestly dangerous contrast present in the country right at that exact moment. With victory practically around the corner, Lincoln doesn't gloat, not at all. Instead, he emphasizes reunifying the country, binding up its wounds. He really wanted Americans, North and South, to be compatriots again. But listening right there in the crowd was John Wilkes Booth, an actor and a deep Southern sympathizer. As Lincoln is up there pleading for peace, Booth is depressed, full of hate, and quietly, silently, plotting his revenge.
Part 2. Breaking the South's Will.
While Lincoln was laying that political groundwork for peace, there was still a brutal military reality happening. The North was deeply frustrated seeing the conflict dragging on and on. People were asking, why waste more lives? And that's the pivotal question. General William T. Sherman believed he had the key to force the Confederacy's hand. He introduced this unusually modern and incredibly destructive concept. Basically, an army can only survive with the support of its people. So if you strike at the everyday populace, the army collapses.
$1.4 billion. That is the estimated damage of what Sherman did next. To execute his plan, he did something totally unprecedented. He removed 62,000 men from their supply lines to march right through the heartland of the Confederacy. Actually, think about that for a second. Marching an entire army without supply lines? It was a massive gamble. They tore up railroads, burned farms, destroyed communication lines, and liberated thousands of slaves all through Georgia and South Carolina. It was absolutely a cruel tactic, but to Sherman, it was the only way to avoid losing even more men in traditional battles.
And man, Sherman's march squeezed the South hard. It set off this breakneck chain of events in April 1865, where the final dominoes fell in just a matter of days. April 2nd, the Union finally breaks through the 292-day siege at Petersburg. Just 1 week later, Appomattox. And merely 5 days after that, the assassination. History was moving at lightning speed. Part 3. Surrender at Appomattox. So on April 9th, General Robert E. Lee is trapped. Seeing no point in continuing, he surrenders to General Ulysses S. Grant. But what really grounds this history in incredible human irony is the location. They met in the parlor of a man named Wilmer McLean. Years earlier, McLean had actually moved his family specifically to try and escape the crossfire of the Civil War, only for the conflict to literally end inside his own house. You can't make this stuff up. Now, the absolutely crucial thing to take away here is how this surrender was handled. Grant and Lee spoke respectfully to one another after years of bitter, bloody warfare. When Lee left, Grant's men understandably began to cheer for their victory. But Grant immediately ordered them to stop. He refused to let his men gloat over a defeated enemy. And that action, it set the exact tone Lincoln wanted for reunification. Just a couple of weeks later, another 89,000 Confederate soldiers would surrender under those exact same similar terms.
Meanwhile, back in Washington, church bells are ringing, crowds are totally jubilant. But for Abraham Lincoln, the relief was intensely personal. The presidency had visibly aged this man. He had lost over 20 pounds, reportedly confessing to someone, "Sometimes I think I am the tiredest man on earth." Yet, as peace finally arrived, his mood lifted. On a carriage ride with his wife Mary, he was uncharacteristically cheerful. He told her that between the war and the tragic loss of their son, they had both been very miserable, but now it was finally time to be happy.
Part 4. A tragic assassination.
That brief, hard-won happiness makes this next transition so incredibly somber. It marks one of the darkest, most shocking nights in all of American history. It's the evening of April 14th. The exhausted president was finally taking a moment to just relax. He attended a comedy at Ford's Theater with his wife and some friends. By all accounts, he was thoroughly enjoying the play, soaking in the audience's laughter, just experiencing a fleeting, beautifully normal human moment.
And then the tragedy unfolds with this awful, calculated precision. In a nearby bar, John Wilkes Booth swallows 2 glasses of brandy to nerve himself. He then walks into the theater, slips quietly into the presidential booth, and calculates his horrific next move. He stood in the shadows, waiting specifically for a moment when the audience's laughter would rise to mask the sound, and then he shot the president. Booth flees the city right into the night. Soldiers desperately carry Lincoln to a boarding house just across the street, but the doctors declare there's nothing they can do. Surrounded by his heartbroken wife, his son, and his cabinet, President Lincoln passes away at 7:22 the very next morning. Never before had a U.S. president been murdered. A shocked, grieving nation watched as a 12-day funeral procession carried their leader back home to Springfield, Illinois.
Part 5. The aftermath and legacy.
The nation somehow had to move forward. The loose ends of the war unraveled pretty quickly militarily. By April 26th, Union cavalry found and killed Booth in a Virginia barn. The last Confederate forces in Texas disintegrated by May. But consider the incredibly surprising fate of Confederate President Jefferson Davis. He was tracked down and imprisoned for 2 years, but he was eventually released without trial. Actually, why is that? Well, the North made the strategic choice not to try him, fearing a jury might actually rule that Southern secession had been legally valid. Wild, right?
3 million. When you look back, the sheer scale of this tragedy is almost impossible to comprehend. Over 3 million Americans fought in this war, brother against brother. To this day, the Civil War remains the bloodiest and deadliest conflict in U.S. history.
But out of all that unfathomable bloodshed, the Union was preserved. Ultimately, the real winners of this era were the millions who would never again be slaves. The 13th Amendment was just the beginning. Future amendments passed by Congress would go on to grant citizenship and voting rights to Black individuals. Significant progress was forged, even though the Southern states would face military occupation and the deeply, deeply turbulent era of Reconstruction. Which really brings us to our final thought. The man who fought to preserve the nation stands as a symbol of empathy, humility, and courage. He guided the country from the passage of the 13th Amendment right to the cusp of a peace he wouldn't even live to see. Think about how the fight for equality continued well into the 20th century and continues now. Lincoln preserved the Union, but are we still striving for true equality? That work that those observers from the galleries knew was just beginning back in 1865, is that a legacy we are still striving to fulfill today? It's a fascinating question, and one that perfectly sets the stage for exploring the complex era of Reconstruction.